I was born on a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind where the clouds hang low, gray and heavy, and everything feels just a little colder than it should. My mother always said it was a beautiful day. My father never mentioned it. Neither of them looked at me the way a parent is supposed to look at a child, like I mattered, like I was the most important person in the world. From the very beginning, I knew my place. I wasn't the favorite. I wasn't the golden child with perfect grades, perfect manners, and perfect looks. That belonged to my sister, Emily, or sometimes to my brother, Mark, whoever got the spotlight that week. And me? I was the background, the shadow, the one they tolerated. When they first brought Emily home from the hospital, everyone cooed, praised, and celebrated. I clutched the edge of my crib and watched as the nurses fussed over her, smiling at my mother's tears of joy. I didn't understand it then. I just felt the first pinch of the invisible barrier that would define my life. I was the child they never really chose. School was no different. While my siblings' accomplishments were framed and displayed in the living room, mine were whispered about, if noticed at all. When I got an A on a difficult test, my father's response was, "That's good, I guess." When Emily brought home a B, it was a celebration. "We're so proud of you, sweetie. You tried so hard." I learned quickly to smile, to shrink, to be quiet. Compliments felt like lies. Attention felt like a trap. I began to watch my family's reactions like a careful scientist, measuring approval, calculating the right amount of effort to stay unnoticed. Birthdays were the worst. When Emily turned 5, the whole neighborhood was invited. When I turned 5, there was a small cake, no decorations, and a quiet "happy birthday" from my parents before they went back to celebrating something else entirely. The lesson was clear. My happiness didn't matter. Their love was conditional, and I had no way to earn it. Middle school brought a cruel new layer to the loneliness. My peers talked about the amazing parents they had, the school trips, the gifts, the pride. I listened and nodded, hiding the emptiness I carried home every day. At home, my parents' attention was reserved for the good kids. I didn't fit the mold. My hobbies, my dreams, my very existence were inconvenient truths they didn't know how to handle. At the dinner table, I spoke cautiously, careful with every word. If I made a suggestion, it was dismissed. If I spoke of my achievements, they waved them off as insignificant. "It's nothing really, don't make a big deal of it," my father would say. Or, "Oh, that's cute," my mother would add. The subtle condescension cut deeper than any harsh criticism. And Emily? She thrived on their attention. Every small accomplishment became a reason for applause. Every minor failure was met with "you'll do better next time" encouragement. Mark was praised for ambition, charm, and personality. And me? I learned early that to survive in my family, I had to disappear. High school was my arena, the first place I could escape their judgments for a few hours each day. I poured myself into my studies, into my passions, into small, quiet victories that no one at home would ever notice. I started working part-time at a small local store, saving every penny. Not for recognition, not for approval, for me. Even then, my parents' words followed me. "Why don't you do something more serious?" my mother asked once, wringing her hands. "Something that will make people notice you?" "Like Emily?" I asked quietly. She didn't answer. She never did. I realized then that their love was transactional. It was given to those who matched their vision of success. It was never unconditional. The real turning point came when I was 16. My parents bought Emily a car for her birthday. Not just any car, a shiny new sedan with leather seats and everything. When my birthday came a month later, I received a card and a small amount of money folded neatly in an envelope. No car, no celebration, just a reminder that I was the child who needed to be content with what she had. I remember sitting on my bed that night, staring at the envelope. I didn't cry at first. I was too angry, too stunned. But later, when the adrenaline faded, the tears came. I cried not because I wanted the car. I cried because they had made it clear, once again, that I was the least loved, the invisible one, the one who didn't matter. That night, I promised myself something. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I swore that one day I would make them see me, not for their approval, but for my own dignity. I left home as soon as I could. College, scholarships, late-night shifts, hard work. I took every opportunity seriously because I knew no one would celebrate me, no one would cheer me on, no one would hand me success. I had to take it myself. After graduation, I started working in a small but growing business. I was ambitious, careful, and persistent. I built something quietly, steadily. My parents didn't ask, didn't notice. Every success was mine alone. Every promotion was mine alone. Every late night, every sacrifice, every dollar saved was mine alone. Meanwhile, my family continued their pattern of favoritism. Emily got recognition. Mark got praise. I became the sibling they pretended to acknowledge only when it was convenient, only when they needed something. The first moment I realized my work mattered beyond my own bank account was subtle. A client called me in for a small project, and their neighbor, who had heard about my company, asked me to handle their property. Word spread. My small business was growing, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. And then it happened. The first time my parents called me for help, not for advice, not for recognition, but because they needed me. I was shocked. At first, I almost didn't answer. After all, they had laughed at me, dismissed my achievements, and treated me like an afterthought. And now, suddenly, I was the one they needed. It was the moment I realized the truth. Love in my family had never been about me. It had always been about control, convenience, and appearances. That night, I wrote down my plan. Not revenge for anger's sake, not cruelty, but justice, recognition, the kind of respect no one could ignore. I would help my family, but on my terms. I would not give them my life, my happiness, or my energy for free. I would show them that the child they had dismissed was capable, strong, and unshakable, and I would never shrink again. The first thing I remember about high school was the way love was measured in my house, in smiles, in attention, in praise. But it was never for me. It was always for Emily or Mark. Their achievements were celebrated as if the world depended on them. My successes were whispered about, dismissed, or forgotten. It wasn't just that I was ignored, it was the active, intentional attention given to everyone else. I watched them, my own parents, beam at my siblings' smallest wins while I became invisible in my own home. And worse, I had no one to share it with. Birthdays were a lesson in quiet humiliation. Emily would be showered with gifts, surprises, parties. Mark would be complimented for his grades or sports achievements. And I? A card, folded money, a whispered, "Happy birthday." That was all, and it stung, not because I wanted more, but because it was so painfully clear where I stood in their eyes. Holidays or no better, I could remember countless Christmas mornings, my parents' faces lighting up for Emily as she tore through wrapping paper. My name barely came up, my presence barely acknowledged. I didn't speak up anymore. I had learned that silence was safer. But the resentment grew quietly, tucked inside me, feeding my determination. I studied hard, not for them, not for approval. I wanted knowledge, I wanted independence. But when I brought home awards, my mother would glance quickly and say, "Oh, that's nice." My father would nod distractedly while checking his phone. No pride, no excitement, nothing. Meanwhile, Emily's minor accomplishments, an art project, a school play, a simple grade, would be framed, displayed, talked about for weeks. She got praise for things that were easy for her, while I had to work my life into shape silently, invisibly, and still receive nothing. It was more than unfair. It was a lesson I would never forget. And then came the comparisons. Oh, how they loved to compare. "Hannah, why can't you be more like Emily?" my mother would say. "Hannah, Mark would never forget to," my father would add. I learned early that no matter how much I tried, it was never enough. The measure of my worth was their favorite, and since I was not it, I was consistently undervalued, dismissed, ignored. I started to retreat into myself. I spent hours reading, writing, or working small jobs to escape. The world outside my house became my sanctuary. The outside world didn't measure my worth by comparison. It didn't care about siblings, favoritism, or past failures. It measured me by results, by effort, by drive, and that was something I could control. At 15, I took my first real part-time job. Small, local, unnoticed. I stocked shelves, cleaned floors, carried boxes. It wasn't glamorous. No one praised me. No one cared. But I loved the feeling of earning something that no one could take away. Every paycheck felt like a quiet triumph. Every satisfied customer felt like a step toward the life I wanted. And I kept it secret. I didn't tell my parents or siblings. Why should I? They wouldn't have cared, and as my money slowly grew, so did a quiet confidence in myself. For the first time in my life, I felt like my efforts mattered, even if no one else noticed. While I built my independence, my family continued their pattern. They relied on others for validation, for support, for praise, and for assistance. Neighbors, friends, extended family, they were the ones who celebrated their achievements. I watched from a distance, carefully noting their patterns, their weaknesses, their overconfidence in the people they deemed more important than me. I learned patience. I learned observation. I learned that invisibility has its own power, because while they laughed, ignored, and dismissed me, I was quietly building a life they didn't see, one that would one day give me leverage. By the time I was 18, small cracks began to appear. My skills and resourcefulness started getting noticed by clients, by teachers, even by family friends. But the recognition wasn't love or respect, it was curiosity. "Wow, Hannah, you did this by yourself?" someone would ask. I'd smile quietly. "Yes," I would say. Inside, I felt the seed of satisfaction. I had achieved something purely for myself, something they could no longer control. And then it happened. A crisis arose, one that my family couldn't handle, something simple yet complicated, something that required skill, patience, and persistence. My parents called, not to apologize, not to praise, but to ask for help. I remember the first time it happened. I looked at the phone, my mother's voice on the other end, shaky and hesitant. "Hannah, we need your help." I paused. I thought about all the years of silence, all the ignored birthdays, all the laughter at my effort, and then I realized this was my moment. They laughed at me, they dismissed me, they ignored me, and now they needed me. The first project I handled for them wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about payback, it was about competence, professionalism, and patience. They watched me work, they noticed my efficiency, they noticed my attention to detail, they noticed my ability to fix things they couldn't handle themselves. And slowly the laughter faded, the dismissive tones stopped. They began to realize that the child they had ignored, the one they never truly loved, was the one they depended on. That dependence was intoxicating, not for me, for them. The realization. By the end of the year, I understood something that changed my perspective completely. Love in my family was never unconditional. Respect was never automatic. Recognition was never my birthright. But power? That I could earn. That I could demand. That I could control. And slowly, quietly, I began to build both. They didn't see it coming, they still didn't understand it, but every smile they withheld, every comparison they made, every subtle dismissal had trained me for this exact moment. When they finally needed me, I wouldn't just help, I would decide how much access they got to my world. I would define the terms. For the first time in my life, I held the cards. The first time I saw my bank balance and realized it was more than I ever dreamed, I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I sat there quietly, staring at the numbers as if they were a secret only I was allowed to know. Money had always been something that belonged to everyone else, my parents, my siblings, people who got the attention I had never received. And now it was mine. I thought about everything that had led to this moment, the late nights working at a small store, the weekends spent cleaning offices. The early mornings walking to school with my lunch packed and nothing else. Every penny I had earned had been carefully saved, every hour carefully measured. I hadn't done it for recognition, I hadn't done it for love, I had done it for me. And now, the power that money represented made me see my family differently. When I went home that evening, my mother was bustling around the kitchen, preparing dinner as if nothing had changed. Emily was talking loudly about her latest shopping spree, her new jacket, her weekend plans, and Mark was sprawled on the couch scrolling through his phone. I walked past them without a word, my mind elsewhere. I could see the way they looked at me, the faint curiosity, the subtle interest that hadn't been there before. They didn't know it yet, but the game had shifted. The first request came sooner than I expected. My mother, who had never praised me for anything, called me quietly into her room. Her voice was soft, almost nervous. "Hannah, could you help me with something?" she asked. I could feel the hesitation in her tone, the unspoken truth that she needed me more than she had ever needed anyone else. I didn't answer right away. I wanted her to understand the weight of the years she had ignored me, the countless birthdays, the countless moments of quiet humiliation. "I can help," I said finally, "but it will be on my terms." Her face fell slightly, but there was no anger in my heart. I wasn't angry anymore. I was clear. I was patient. I knew my worth now, and I was done shrinking for them. The first time I set my terms, they were stunned. The careful structure I outlined, the contracts, the schedules, they were used to receiving whatever they wanted with a smile, assuming I would comply without question. But now I was firm, I was professional, and they needed it. The realization in their eyes was subtle at first, a quiet shock that slowly turned into respect, though they didn't know it yet. When I began helping them, it wasn't about money, that was secondary. It was about showing them that the child they had overlooked was capable, intelligent, and powerful. Every task I managed, every problem I solved, reminded them silently of what they had ignored. They had laughed at my first job, my part-time efforts, my careful planning. Now they depended on the very skills they had mocked, and it was intoxicating to watch the shift. One evening, after a particularly long day, my father asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "How did you learn to do this so well?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost vulnerable. I looked at him and remembered every time he had dismissed my achievements, every time he had compared me to Emily or Mark, every time he had laughed when I had tried to make my mark. "I worked for it," I said simply, "and I've had to learn the hard way." They were beginning to understand, slowly, painfully. Love had never been given to me freely, and respect had never been earned without effort. Now they were learning that the child they had overlooked had built something far more substantial than they had ever imagined. Every time they asked for advice, for help, for solutions, they were reminded that I had outgrown the role of invisible daughter. I was no longer someone they could dismiss. The first time I realized just how much power my success gave me, I watched my parents argue over a decision they could not make without me. My mother wanted one solution, my father another, and Emily was trying to insert herself into the conversation, but the truth was clear, they didn't know what to do without me. The irony made me smile quietly. For years, they had ignored me, laughed at my jobs, and now, in a moment of need, they had no choice but to rely on the very person they had sidelined. It wasn't cruel to feel satisfaction. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. It was simply validation. All those years of quiet effort, of scraping by, of building my life piece by piece while being invisible, had finally given me leverage, and I was not about to waste it. As my business grew, so did my confidence. I started making choices that I had never allowed myself before. I spent my money on things I wanted, not what anyone else expected me to want. I traveled, I learned, I networked, and I expanded my skills. With every success, my family noticed subtly at first, a question here, a compliment there. small acknowledgments that carried weight because they had never been freely given. One night, as I walked past the living room where my family was gathered, I noticed Emily bragging about her latest shopping spree, her new jacket, her weekend plans, and Mark was sprawled on the couch scrolling through his phone. I walked past them without a word, my mind elsewhere. I could see the way they looked at me, the faint curiosity, the subtle interest that hadn't been there before. They didn't know it yet, but the game had shifted. When I began helping them, it wasn't about money. That was secondary. It was about showing them that the child they had overlooked was capable, intelligent, and powerful. Every task I managed, every problem I solved, reminded them silently of what they had ignored. They had laughed at my first job, my part-time efforts, my careful planning. Now they depended on the very skills they had mocked, and it was intoxicating to watch the shift. One evening, after a particularly long day, my father asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "How did you learn to do this so well?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost vulnerable. I looked at him and remembered every time he had dismissed my achievements, every time he had compared me to Emily or Mark, every time he had laughed when I had tried to make my mark. "I worked for it," I said simply, "and I've had to learn the hard way." They were beginning to understand, slowly, painfully. Love had never been given to me freely, and respect had never been earned without effort. Now they were learning that the child they had overlooked had built something far more substantial than they had ever imagined. Every time they asked for advice, for help, for solutions, they were reminded that I had outgrown the role of invisible daughter. I was no longer someone they could dismiss. The first time I realized just how much power my success gave me, I watched my parents argue over a decision they could not make without me. My mother wanted one solution, my father another, and Emily was trying to insert herself into the conversation, but the truth was clear: they didn't know what to do without me. The irony made me smile quietly. For years they had ignored me, laughed at my jobs, and now, in a moment of need, they had no choice but to rely on the very person they had sidelined. It wasn't cruel to feel satisfaction. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. It was simply validation. All those years of quiet effort, of scraping by, of building my life piece by piece while being invisible, had finally given me leverage, and I was not about to waste it. As my business grew, so did my confidence. I started making choices that I had never allowed myself before. I spent my money on things I wanted, not what anyone else expected me to want. I traveled, I learned, I networked, and I expanded my skills. With every success, my family noticed subtly at first. A question here, a compliment there, small acknowledgments that carried weight because they had never been freely given. One night, as I walked past the living room where my family was gathered, I noticed Emily bragging about her latest shopping spree, her new jacket, her weekend plans, and Mark was sprawled on the couch scrolling through his phone. I walked past them without a word, my mind elsewhere. I could see the way they looked at me, the faint curiosity, the subtle interest that hadn't been there before. They didn't know it yet, but the game had shifted. When I began helping them, it wasn't about money. That was secondary. It was about showing them that the child they had overlooked was capable, intelligent, and powerful. Every task I managed, every problem I solved, reminded them silently of what they had ignored. They had laughed at my first job, my part-time efforts, my careful planning. Now they depended on the very skills they had mocked, and it was intoxicating to watch the shift. One evening, after a particularly long day, my father asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "How did you learn to do this so well?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost vulnerable. I looked at him and remembered every time he had dismissed my achievements, every time he had compared me to Emily or Mark, every time he had laughed when I had tried to make my mark. "I worked for it," I said simply, "and I've had to learn the hard way." They were beginning to understand, slowly, painfully. Love had never been given to me freely, and respect had never been earned without effort. Now they were learning that the child they had overlooked had built something far more substantial than they had ever imagined. Every time they asked for advice, for help, for solutions, they were reminded that I had outgrown the role of invisible daughter. I was no longer someone they could dismiss. The first time I realized just how much power my success gave me, I watched my parents argue over it. I walked into the house one last time, not as the invisible child, not as the quiet observer, not as the one they had always dismissed. I walked in as someone they had underestimated for years, someone whose hard work, determination, and resilience had quietly built a life they could never take away. I was Chloe, the daughter they ignored, the child they never loved, the woman they now needed. The atmosphere was heavy, thick with unspoken tension. My mother stood in the living room, hands clasped, her eyes wide with something I couldn't immediately name. My father's face was pale, and Mark and Emily's chatter had completely stopped. They were all waiting for me. I took a deep breath. I could feel the power I had slowly cultivated over the years coursing through me. Every struggle, every tear, every lonely birthday, it had led to this moment, and I would not let it be wasted. They started speaking, haltingly at first, fumbling words they had never bothered to speak before. "Chloe, we need your help." My mother's voice cracked. My father's lips quivered. Even my siblings looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. I paused. I let them feel it, the years of neglect, the years of being invisible, the years of being the least loved. I let the silence stretch, heavy and uncomfortable. "Yes," I said finally, "I can help, but it will be on my terms." Shock rippled through them. My mother's mouth opened and closed. My father's eyebrows shot up. Even Emily and Mark looked confused. They were so used to compliance, to taking for granted that I would always say yes without conditions. Now I was setting boundaries. I smiled, quietly, and began to outline the rules, not for punishment, not for revenge in the traditional sense, but for dignity. Every task I would perform, every piece of advice I would give, every bit of support I offered, they would receive it under conditions I set. They had ignored me, laughed at my efforts, dismissed my worth, and now they were learning that respect is earned, not demanded. As I spoke, I watched their reactions. My mother's shoulders slumped with understanding. My father's jaw tightened. Mark and Emily shifted uncomfortably, realizing that I had become someone they could not control. They were dependent on me now, and that dependence was a lesson long overdue. Later that night, as I prepared to leave, my mother approached me. "Chloe, I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have seen you. I should have loved you the way you deserved." I looked at her, and for a brief moment I felt a flicker of the little girl who had longed for her mother's approval. But I didn't give in. I didn't need her apology to validate my life. I had built myself without it. "I forgive you," I said softly, "but I will not live in the shadow of neglect anymore. I will not shrink to make you comfortable. I have chosen myself." I stepped out into the cool night air, and the city lights reflected off the windows of the house I had once felt invisible in. The air felt different now, lighter, freer, full of possibility. The weight of years of silence, of humiliation, of neglect lifted from my shoulders. For the first time, I didn't feel small. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. For the first time, I felt seen, not by them, but by myself. They had laughed at my job, they had doubted my worth, they had chosen others over me again and again, but now the child they ignored had grown into someone unstoppable, someone confident, someone in control. And as I walked away, leaving the past behind, I knew the truth. I didn't need them to love me, I didn't need them to respect me, I only needed myself. And that was more than enough. They were finally aware of the woman they had overlooked, and I was finally free from the family that had never valued me, not because they hated me, but because they had never realized my worth until it was undeniable. I had chosen myself, and that was the revenge, the victory, and the peace I had always deserved. The wind brushed against my face as I continued walking. Every step was lighter than the last, carrying me toward a future where I was the priority, where my efforts mattered, and where no one could ever make me feel small again. I smiled. This was my life now, my choices, my rules, my freedom. They had treated me like the least loved child, they had underestimated me, they had ignored me, but I had chosen myself, and that was more powerful than anything they could ever take away.